Thank you. Thank you for being here. I know many of you have traveled a long way, and I don't take that lightly. So let me begin by telling you something important. What I'm about to share with you today isn't a prediction. It's not speculation. It's not fear-mongering. It's simply the mechanics of how the economic machine works. And once you understand these mechanics, you'll see exactly where we're headed. Not because I have a crystal ball, but because the math is the math. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine you worked for 40 years. Every single paycheck, money was taken from you. Not a choice, not a suggestion, but a promise. The government said, give us this money now, and when you reach retirement, we'll give it back with interest. We'll take care of you. You trusted that promise. You planned your life around it. You raised your children, paid your mortgage, saved what you could, all while believing that when the time came, that promise would be kept. Now imagine being told you're getting a raise. A 2.8% increase in your Social Security benefits. Sounds good, right? Finally, someone is looking out for you. But then imagine discovering that at the exact same time, the cost of the health care you need to survive, the Medicare Part B premium that comes directly out of your check, is rising by nearly 10%, 9.7% to be exact. The premium is jumping from $185 a month to $202.90. Let me do that math for you, because this is important. If you're receiving the average Social Security benefit of about $2,000 a month, that 2.8% raise gives you roughly $56 more per month. But the Medicare increase takes back nearly $18 of that immediately. Your net increase is closer to $38. That's 1.9% in real terms. Meanwhile, healthcare inflation for seniors runs at 5% annually. Food is up, energy is up, housing is up. You are mechanically poorer on January 1st than you were on December 31st. That's not a benefit increase. That's a benefit cut disguised as a benefit increase. And I want to explain to you why this is happening mechanically and what it tells us about what's coming next. You see, the economy is a machine. It's made of simple parts that create complex results. Transactions, credit, debt, productivity. These pieces interact in predictable ways. One person's spending is another person's income. When you spend money at the grocery store, that becomes income for the store owner, who then spends it somewhere else, creating income for someone else. This is how the machine works. And when you understand this, you can see the patterns that most people miss because they're too zoomed in on the day-to-day noise. Most people don't see what's happening because they're caught up in the blizzard of information. They watch the news, they see the headlines, they react emotionally. But if you step back and look at the machine itself, you can see something very troubling emerging. The machine is jamming. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but slowly, mechanically, inevitably. And the first place it's showing stress is in the retirement system that 75 million Americans depend on. Now, you might be thinking, Ray, this has happened before. We've always adjusted. Why is this time different? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Because I've been wrong before. Catastrophically wrong. And that experience taught me how to tell the difference between a temporary adjustment and a fundamental shift in the machine. Let me tell you about 1982. In 1981 and 82, I became convinced that the United States economy was about to fall into a depression. My research had led me to believe that with the Federal Reserve's tight money policy and lots of debt outstanding, there would be a global wave of debt defaults. And if the Fed tried to handle it by printing money, inflation would accelerate. I was so certain that a depression was coming that I proclaimed it in newspaper columns, on television, even in testimony to Congress. When Mexico defaulted on its debt in August of 1982, I was sure I was right. Boy, was I wrong. What I considered improbable was exactly what happened. Fed Chairman Paul Volcker's move to lower interest rates and make money and credit available helped jumpstart a bull market in stocks, and the United States economy enjoyed the greatest non-inflationary growth period in its history over the next 18 years. I was dead wrong, and that failure nearly destroyed me. I had to borrow $4,000 from my father just to pay my family's bills. I was so broke that I had to let go of every employee at Bridgewater. It was one of the most painful experiences of my life. But here's what I learned, and this is crucial, that failure was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it gave me the humility I needed to balance my aggressiveness. I learned a great fear of being wrong that shifted my mindset from thinking I'm right to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? And I saw clearly that the best way to answer that question is by finding other independent thinkers who see things differently from me and stress testing my reasoning against theirs. After that failure, I did something that changed everything. I studied every major debt crisis of the last 500 years: the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, Weimar, Germany, the United States in the 1930s, Japan in the 1990s, the 2008 financial crisis. And I found a template, a pattern that repeats across centuries and civilizations because human nature doesn't change. The greed and fear that drove the tulip bubble in Holland are the same greed and fear driving markets today. The debt dynamics that brought down empires are the same debt dynamics we're seeing now. Let me explain this template, because once you understand it, everything else becomes clear. The economy moves in cycles, not random cycles, but predictable ones, driven by credit and debt. There are two main cycles: the short-term debt cycle, which lasts about 5 to 8 years. This is what most people call the business cycle. Boom and bust, expansion and recession. The Federal Reserve manages this by raising and lowering interest rates. When the economy is too hot, they raise rates to cool it down. When it's too cold, they lower rates to stimulate borrowing and spending. But beneath this short-term cycle, there's a longer, more powerful force at work: the long-term debt cycle. This one lasts about 50 to 75 years, roughly a human lifetime, which is why most people don't recognize it. They've never seen it before. The long-term debt cycle is driven by the accumulation of debt relative to income over decades. During the upswing, which can last 50 years or more, debt levels rise, asset prices rise, and everyone feels wealthy. Credit is easy. Times are good. People forget that debt has to be paid back. But eventually, the debt burden becomes too heavy. The machine reaches its limit. And that's when you get what I call a deleveraging. A deleveraging is different from a recession. In a recession, the central bank can lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing and get things moving again. But in a deleveraging, interest rates are already at or near zero. There's no more room to stimulate. The debt burden is so large that it can't be relieved by lowering rates. The machine jams. This is where we are now. The United States is in the late stages of a long-term debt cycle, not at the very end, but close enough that the mechanics are starting to show stress. And the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. Let me give you some numbers, and please pay close attention, because these numbers are the foundation of everything I'm going to tell you today. As of December of 2025, the total gross national debt of the United States is $38.4 trillion. Let me say that again, $38.4 trillion. That number is so large it's almost meaningless to the human mind. So let me put it in perspective. Over the past year, the rate of increase has averaged $6.12 billion per day. That's $255 million per hour, $4.25 million per minute, over $70,000 per second. While I've been speaking this sentence, the national debt has increased by hundreds of thousands of dollars. But here's the number that should truly concern you. The United States paid $981 billion in net interest over the last 12 months. That's nearly $1 trillion just on interest payments, not paying down the debt, not funding Social Security or Medicare or national defense, just interest. 5 years ago, that number was $345 billion. Interest payments have almost tripled in 5 years. The Congressional Budget Office projects that net interest as a share of outlays will be nearly 14% in fiscal year 2026. We are now paying more in interest than we spend on Medicare or national defense. And here's the trap. If interest rates stay elevated, this number keeps climbing. You start paying interest on the money you borrowed to pay interest. That's the debt spiral. That's when the machine doesn't just jam, it breaks. Now, let me connect this to what's happening with Social Security and Medicare, because this is where the mechanics become personal. This is where they affect you directly. The Social Security Trust Fund is not an abstraction. It's a mechanical system with inputs and outputs. Money comes in from payroll taxes. Workers and employers pay into the system. Money goes out to beneficiaries. Retirees receive their monthly checks. For decades, the inputs exceeded the outputs. The system ran surpluses, which were invested in Treasury securities. Those securities make up the trust fund reserves. But starting in 2021, total cost began to exceed total income. The system is now drawing down those reserves to pay benefits. And here's the critical point. When those reserves hit zero, the law, not politicians, the law requires an automatic cut to all benefits. There is no vote, there is no debate. It is automatic. In June of 2025, the trustees projected that the primary old age and survivors insurance trust fund would be depleted in 2033. That was alarming enough. But then, in August, Social Security's chief actuary announced that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was signed by the President on July 4, 2025, will advance that depletion date to late 2032. That's not 8 years from now. That's 7 years. 7 years until an automatic 23 to 24% cut to all benefits. Think about what that means. If you're 60 years old today, you'll reach your normal retirement age just as the system becomes insolvent. If you're already retired, you'll be in your mid-70s when your benefits get cut by nearly a quarter. And this isn't a worst-case scenario. This is the baseline projection from the government's own actuaries. Now, the politicians will tell you not to worry. They'll say Congress will fix it. They always do. And I want to explain to you mechanically why that thinking is flawed. Every solution to the Social Security shortfall requires one of three things. You can cut benefits, you can raise taxes, or you can print money. Let's consider each option. Cutting benefits is politically suicidal. No politician wants to tell 75 million Americans that they're getting less than they were promised. This is especially true when those Americans vote in higher percentages than any other demographic. So cutting benefits directly is almost impossible politically. Raising taxes is also difficult. You can raise payroll taxes on workers, but that reduces their disposable income and slows the economy. You can raise taxes on the wealthy, but there are limits to how much revenue you can extract before it becomes counterproductive. And any tax increase faces enormous political resistance. So, what's left? Printing money. This is the path of least resistance. It's politically painless in the short term because no one has to vote for a benefit cut or a tax increase. The Federal Reserve simply creates money, the Treasury issues bonds, and the government keeps paying benefits. Everyone's happy, right? Wrong. Because printing money has a cost, and that cost is inflation. When you create more money without creating more goods and services, each dollar becomes worth less. Prices rise. And who gets hurt the most by rising prices? People on fixed incomes, retirees, the very people the system was supposed to protect. This is what I call the quiet default. There are two ways a government can break its promises. The honest way is to say, we can't pay. That's explicit default. It causes a depression, but at least it's transparent. The dishonest way is to pay in currency that's worth less. That's implicit default. You get your check, but it buys less. The promise is technically kept, but it's functionally broken. History shows that governments always choose the dishonest path. It's too politically painful to cut benefits explicitly. It's too politically painful to raise taxes significantly. So they inflate, they print, and they transfer wealth quietly from creditors to debtors. And who are the creditors in this system? Savers, retirees, people living on fixed incomes, people who hold bonds, expecting to be paid back in dollars that maintain their value. And who is the biggest debtor? The United States government, with $38 trillion in obligations. This is a mechanical wealth transfer, from you to them, disguised as monetary policy. It's not a conspiracy. It's not malicious. It's simply the path of least resistance for politicians who need to get reelected. And it's been happening for decades. Social Security benefits lost about 20% of their buying power between 2010 and 2024, according to the Senior Citizens League. That's not an accident. That's the machine working exactly as it's designed to work. Now let me tell you about paradigm shifts, because this concept is essential to understanding what's happening. Every decade operates under different assumptions, different rules, different beliefs about how the world works. In the 1970s, the paradigm was inflation. Everyone expected prices to keep rising, so they borrowed heavily and bought hard assets. In the 1980s and 90s, the paradigm shifted to disinflation. Inflation fell, interest rates fell, and both stocks and bonds rose together. This was the great bull market, the golden age, for traditional portfolios. In the 2000s and 2010s, the paradigm shifted again. After the 2008 crisis, central banks dropped rates to zero and kept them there. They printed trillions of dollars through quantitative easing. The assumption was that central banks would always support asset prices, that you could buy stocks or bonds and the Fed would bail you out if things went wrong. This paradigm made everyone feel safe. It made everyone feel wealthy. But it was built on an unsustainable foundation. And now the paradigm is shifting again. Interest rates have risen from near zero to levels not seen in decades. Inflation, which everyone thought was dead, came roaring back. The 40-year bond bull market is over, and the assumptions that guided investment decisions for an entire generation no longer apply. Here's why this matters for retirees. For 40 years, the advice was simple. As you age, move out of stocks and into bonds. Safe, steady, predictable. But that advice assumed interest rates would keep falling. When rates fall, bond prices rise. You win twice, collecting interest and enjoying capital gains. But when rates rise, as they have, bond prices fall. If you bought a 30-year Treasury bond 5 years ago, you've lost significant value. And here's the deeper problem. The government that issued you that bond owes $38 trillion. They're paying nearly $1 trillion a year just in interest. The math suggests they will be repaid in depreciated dollars. That's not default in the traditional sense. That's the quiet default I've been describing. The people who understood this paradigm shift early have already repositioned. The people who haven't are still holding assets designed for a world that no longer exists. And many of those people are retirees who were told bonds were safe. Now let me explain what I call the 4 levers of deleveraging, because this framework shows you exactly what options policymakers have and why they're likely to choose the path they'll choose. When a debt crisis reaches the deleveraging phase, there are only 4 ways to reduce the debt burden relative to income. 4 levers that policymakers can pull. Understanding these levers helps you understand what's coming and how to position yourself. Lever 1 is austerity, cutting spending. When you spend less, you can pay down debt faster. This sounds responsible, and it is. But austerity is deflationary. When the government spends less, that's less income for the people who are receiving that spending. When consumers spend less, that's less income for businesses. Austerity feeds on itself, creating a downward spiral. It's economically painful and politically almost impossible in a democracy. Lever 2 is debt defaults and restructuring. This means some debts don't get paid back in full. Loans are forgiven. Bankruptcies are declared. Creditors take losses. This is also deflationary because it destroys the asset side of balance sheets. If you're a bank and your loans don't get paid back, you have less money to lend. Credit contracts, the economy shrinks. It's painful, but it's honest. The debt is reduced explicitly. Lever 3 is wealth transfers. This means taking money from those who have it and giving it to those who need it. Usually through taxes, you tax the wealthy and use the revenue to pay down debt or fund social programs. This is politically difficult because wealthy people have political influence, and there are limits to how much you can tax before it becomes counterproductive. But some wealth transfer is usually part of any deleveraging. Lever 4 is money printing. The central bank creates money. which the government uses to pay its debts and fund its operations. This is inflationary because more money chasing the same goods and services drives prices up. But inflation has a hidden benefit for debtors. It reduces the real value of debt. If you owe $1 million and inflation doubles the price of everything, you still owe $1 million, but that million buys half as much. You've effectively transferred wealth from your creditors to yourself. Now, here's the key insight. A beautiful deleveraging balances all four levers. The deflationary forces of austerity and defaults are balanced against the inflationary force of money printing. Wealth transfers help cushion the blow for those who need it most. The debt burden comes down gradually, without crashing the economy or causing hyperinflation. This is what happened in the United States after 2008. It was painful, but it was managed. It was a beautiful deleveraging. An ugly deleveraging relies too heavily on one lever. If you have too much austerity, you get a depression like the 1930s. If you have too much money printing without the other levers, you get hyperinflation like Weimar Germany in the 1920s, when it took wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. If you have too many defaults without cushioning, you get social unrest and political instability. Looking at what's happening now in the United States, I see an imbalance. We're not cutting spending. The deficit in fiscal year 2025 was $1.8 trillion. We're not allowing defaults in any meaningful way. We're not raising taxes significantly. We're relying almost entirely on borrowing and printing. The One Big Beautiful Bill added $3.4 trillion to projected deficits over 10 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office. That's not balanced. That's setting up for inflation that will quietly steal from everyone on a fixed income. The Federal Reserve is caught in a trap. If they print money to fund the deficit, they cause inflation, which hurts retirees on fixed incomes. If they don't print credit contracts, the economy slows, tax revenue falls, and the insolvency date accelerates. There's no easy way out. There's only choices about who bears the pain and when. And right now, the choice being made, perhaps not consciously but mechanically, is that retirees will bear the pain through the quiet default of inflation. Let me give you some more context on what this means in human terms, because numbers can be abstract, but suffering is concrete. A 65-year-old retiring today can expect to spend approximately $172,500 on health care over their remaining lifetime, according to Fidelity's 20% net 25 retiree health care cost estimate. That's up 4% from just last year. And that number doesn't include long-term care, dental, vision, or hearing. It doesn't include periods of poor health or chronic conditions. It's just the baseline. Healthcare inflation typically runs about 5% annually for seniors, roughly double the rate of general inflation. So if you're planning your retirement, assuming 2 or 3% inflation, you're planning to fail. Your healthcare costs will outpace your income growth year after year until you're forced to make impossible choices. Do I buy my medication or pay my property taxes? Do I heat my home or eat 3 meals a day? This is already happening. Seniors are skipping vacations to cover medical costs. They're cutting back on food. They're delaying necessary medical procedures. And this is before the trust fund runs out. This is with benefits at full levels. Imagine what happens when those benefits get cut by 24% automatically in 2032. The people who understand what's coming can prepare. The people who don't will be swept away, not by a sudden crash, but by the slow, grinding erosion of purchasing power that leaves them poorer each year, even as they receive the same nominal check. So what do? How do you position yourself when you understand these mechanics? Let me share the principles I've used to navigate every crisis I've faced, including the one I didn't see coming in 1982. The first principle is to calculate your real income, not your nominal income. Take your Social Security payment, subtract your Medicare Part B premium, subtract Part D if you have prescription drug coverage, subtract your Medigap or Medicare Advantage premium. What's left is your real disposable income. Now track that number year over year in inflation-adjusted terms. If it's shrinking, you have a problem that needs solving. Don't let the nominal increases fool you into thinking you're keeping pace. The second principle is to hold more cash than feels comfortable. I know this sounds counterintuitive when inflation is running. Cash loses value to inflation, right? But cash is optionality. Cash is the ability to act when others are forced to sell. In 2008, I had cash reserves that allowed me to buy great companies at fire sale prices when everyone else was panicking. Berkshire bought into Goldman Sachs and General Electric at terms they never would have gotten in normal times. You don't need billions. You need 12 months of expenses in liquid reserves, enough to survive without selling your core assets at the worst possible time. The third principle is to own things that cannot be printed. Gold has been a store of value for 5,000 years, not because it's magical, but because it's scarce. Governments can't create more gold by clicking a button the way they can create dollars. When governments print money to solve debt problems, gold tends to hold its purchasing power. I'm not saying gold will make you rich. It won't. Gold is insurance, not investment. But 10 to 15% of your assets in gold and commodities provides protection against the quiet default of currency debasement. The fourth principle is to reduce your exposure to long-term government promises. Long-term treasury bonds are promises from a government that owes $38 trillion and is adding to that debt at $6 billion per day. The math suggests those promises will be repaid in depreciated dollars. If you must hold bonds, keep the duration short. A 2-year treasury that returns your principal in 24 months has much less inflation risk than a 30-year bond that locks you in for decades. The fifth principle is diversification, which I call the holy grail of investing. This is the most important concept I can share with you. If you can find 15 to 20 good, uncorrelated return streams, you can dramatically reduce your risk without reducing your expected return. The key word is uncorrelated. Assets that don't all move together. If all your assets go up and down at the same time, you're not diversified. You're just spread out. Think about the 4 economic environments I mentioned earlier. Rising growth, falling growth, rising inflation, falling inflation. Every asset performs well in some environments and poorly in others. Stocks do well when growth is rising. Bonds traditionally do well when inflation is falling. Commodities do well when inflation is rising. Cash does well when everything else is falling. The mistake most people make is betting everything on one environment. If you're 100% in stocks, you're betting on rising growth forever. If you're 100% in bonds, you're betting on falling inflation forever. Neither bet is safe, especially during a paradigm shift when the old rules stop working. The sixth principle is flexibility. The most dangerous position is rigidity. The people who survive paradigm shifts are those who can adapt. Don't marry any position. Don't fall in love with any asset. Be willing to change when the evidence changes. I was wrong in 1982 because I was too rigid, too certain, too attached to my view. The experience taught me to hold my views loosely and update them constantly as new information comes in. Now, let me address something I know many of you are thinking. Ray, if things are so bad, why isn't everyone panicking? Why are markets relatively calm? Why does life seem normal? The answer goes back to the nature of the long-term debt cycle. It moves slowly. A bathtub filling with water looks normal until the moment it overflows. The problems I'm describing are not problems for tomorrow or next month. They're problems for 2032 and beyond. But by then, it will be too late to prepare. The time to prepare is now. While the mechanics are visible, but the crisis hasn't arrived. Most people won't prepare. That's also human nature. We discount the future. We focus on immediate concerns. We assume tomorrow will look like today. And for most people, by the time the crisis becomes obvious, their options will be limited. They'll be forced to sell assets at depressed prices, take benefits cuts they didn't plan for, and reduce their standard of living dramatically. But you don't have to be most people. You're here. You're listening. You're learning how the machine works. And that knowledge is power. I want to close with something my father taught me. He said the most important thing in life is to know what you don't know. That lesson saved me after 1982, when I realized how wrong I could be. It's guided every decision I've made since. I don't know exactly how the Social Security crisis will be resolved. I don't know exactly when inflation will spike or by how much. I don't know which politicians will be in power or what decisions they'll make. But I do know the mechanics of the machine. I know that debt levels are unsustainable. I know that the quiet default of inflation is the path of least resistance. I know that retirees on fixed incomes are most vulnerable to that default. And I know that pain plus reflection equals progress. The pain is coming whether you prepare or not. The reflection is optional. The progress depends on what you do next. The machine is indifferent to your suffering, but you don't have to be indifferent to the machine. You can understand it. You can work with it. You can position yourself to survive what's coming and even thrive in the new paradigm that emerges. I've given you the mechanics. I've shown you the math. I've shared the principles that have guided me through 50 years of navigating these cycles. The template is clear. The pattern is repeating. The only question is whether you'll act on this knowledge or let it slip away like so many warnings that came before. Remember, every crisis is also an opportunity. Wealth doesn't disappear during deleveragings. It transfers from the unprepared to the prepared, from the rigid to the flexible, from those who cling to the old paradigm to those who embrace the new one. You can be on the right side of that transfer, but only if you start now. The rest is up to you. Thank you.